But just wanted to point out, and we're going to talk about how we set the standards for surface water quality and in turn wastewater discharge as well. They're set forth to protect those water bodies that we've mentioned so many times throughout the day, those lakes, ponds, rivers, bays, estuaries, streams, the all-encompassing term water body, if you will. And it's sort of a three-pronged approach. So you remember I mentioned designated uses when I first defined water quality. If you could think back to that very first slide. Water quality is a relative term based on how that water body is used, or potentially used, or seen to be used. And what TCEQ will go in and do is look at each water body in the state, and then we'll assign it one or more of these 5 designated uses. So we have a use to support aquatic life, contact recreation. People are fishing, boating, swimming. There are different tiers of contact recreation, primary or secondary contact, for example. Public water supply, people are using it as a drinking water source, consuming fish out of it. And general uses, and general uses is basically a catch-all. If it doesn't fall within one of the first 4, it can be rotated in or covered by that general use. And this deals with things like agricultural irrigation, seagrass propagation, oyster, shellfish production, for example. And so TCEQ will go in and assign one or more or all, maybe, of these uses to a particular water segment or particular water body. And with each one of these uses comes a different set of standards for each one of the parameters we talked about earlier. Physical, chemical, biological parameters. And while the most stringent are going to be the ones dealing with human health, so your contact recreation, public water supply, fish consumption, for example. And then some lesser standards for stuff like ag irrigation. Obviously it doesn't need to be cleaned up quite to the same degree if it's only being used for irrigation as it does for public water supply, human consumption. So TCEQ will assign the uses. With those uses, it will come with a certain set of standards which TCEQ sets. I'll talk about that role next. And lastly, there's a mandate or an anti-degradation policy, which basically in short means that if we have clean waters or a water body that's nearing impairment, you're just not going to let it get any worse than it is. So it requires that states take steps to keep clean waters clean or marginally impaired waters from becoming worse or further impaired. So TCEQ, as I mentioned, defines how these water bodies are used. They assign those designated uses. Develops water quality standards for each use. And they reevaluate the water quality standards every 3 years. So there is a mechanism in there for going back and looking at the standards and saying, are they still appropriate? Has there been new sciences developed, maybe new testing techniques? Do we need to revise some, lower them, raise them? It's just a mechanism to go back in there and make sure that we've got it right and we don't need to change anything. So in addition to TCEQ's responsibilities for assigning these uses and setting these standards, they're required to report back to EPA, to the federal government, that we're making progress or at least looking at what we need to do next. And they do so in a report that we call the Texas Integrated Report. And what this does is evaluates looks at all of the water bodies in the state and reports back to EPA on the status of those water bodies. And it can range 1 of 5 categories they can assign to each water body, ranging from completely clean, no issues, to category 5, it's impaired for 1 or more uses. And when you get to category 5 and it's been listed as impaired, that's when you get on the dreaded 303D list. And we've heard that term earlier today, and this is what they're talking about. And 303D simply is Section 303D of that Clean Water Act, dealing with those impaired water bodies and requiring this list. And this is the list you don't want to be on if you're a water body. If you're impaired, if you're in bad shape, this is where you go. And once you're on that list, it requires that the state take action to improve that water body or get it delisted, address that impairment within a certain time frame, which is 13 years. They have to take action. The state has to take action within 13 years of its first or its listing to address these water quality issues. So those 5 categories of attainment within that report, as I mentioned, category 1, meaning you're A-OK, no water quality impairments, you're meeting all the standards for all the uses for that water body. Great job, pat on the back, check mark, gold star. Category 2 and 3 deal with the level of data that we have available. It's important to note, I mean, Texas is a big state. Remember, as we heard from Jennifer's presentation, and we don't have anywhere near the amount of manpower or resources to evaluate the 191,000 miles of rivers and stream that we have in the state on a continuous basis. So we do targeted monitoring, and we evaluate which water bodies are more of a priority. Obviously, those that are sources of drinking water are going to take priority if they have issues over a creek that no one swims in or fishes in.
Galen, when you say we, who are you referring to?
We as a whole, as a state, TCEQ are the ones who are going to go in and assign these uses. So they will, through a partnership, collect data. There are entities, river authorities, for example, that aid and assist in collecting water quality data, but they're the ones that assign the impairments, set the standards, and assign it one of these 5 uses. And I just want to make the point about, you know, not every water body in the state is monitored each year on a continual basis. It's just very expensive, and we don't have the manpower simply to do so. Sir?
Are these reports available to us?
Absolutely. If you Google Texas Integrated Report, TCQ, or 303D list, TCQ, the first links that come up will lead you right to this site.
Are they pretty readable?
They're readable. The list itself is in PDF, so it breaks it out by river basin, and it can be kind of cryptic by the code. But I believe TCQ on their website has a search function where you can search for impairment, either through a viewer, which you can look at a map and look at your area specifically, and it'll show you which segments are impaired. And by clicking on some of the layers, it'll show you what it's impaired for and some other stuff. I'm not 100%, I haven't been on there and played with this feature, but I think you can even search by county or by river basin. Anyone know any more information?
By river basin, so like how they were showing over in the Trinity Basin, so because the document is just so large, they actually do break it out by river basin. Or you can, they kind of split it up into different ways you can view the data. But basically it's just a long list of all of the assessment units, and well, all the segments, and then broken up into smaller
Will those
assessment
units be identified by the name of our little creek that flows through our property?
Right, and since it's a PDF, you can just search, you can search Trinity, you can search the number, if you use the segment number, and since Trinity is river basin 8, they all start with 08 something. So that's kind of the giveaway if you're...
So if I search for Parker Creek, they might tell me what unit number it is?
Right, like you could search like Richland Creek, or anything, research by name, and it'll come up, and then under each one of those it'll tell you what it's listed for, when it was listed. It'll actually show you the actual...
Where the sampling was done?
No, but you can go to the Trinity River Basin.
Yeah, Trinity,
You can go to the Clean Rivers Program website, and because most of the monitoring is done by river authorities and other partners, and they actually have a really good website that you can look on a map and you can search that way. I find the website to be better than to search from what I would consider the average user, not just searching the list. I think it's easier to find what you want. It'll tell you how many sites, it'll say what they're monitoring for, and things like that. And every year, all the Clean Rivers Program partners actually go through and they decide, do we still need to keep all these sites? Do we need to add sites here? Do we not need to monitor for these certain parameters and things like that? So, sorry, I kind of...
No, you excellent. Thank you.
Yeah, so Clean Rivers Program, just search that, or like Galen said, Texas Integrated Report.
Thanks, Ashley. She hit it right on the head. You, sir, obviously know which watershed you're in, but for those that don't, if you are maybe a step behind, EPA has a Surf Your Watershed feature you can find by easy search. Enter in your zip code, county, or anything, and it will tell you what watershed you live in or which ones are in the area. So if you need a starting place and don't know what water body or watershed you're in, that's a good tool there too. And so categories 2 and 3, as I was mentioning, just mean that there is a lack in data. So category 2, we know that you're obtaining some of your uses, but we don't have enough data to know that you're obtaining all. And category 3 just means we don't have enough data, period, to know if you're attaining any of your uses, much less one. And while it can be in a lack of resources or in a lack of sampling, it can also be from a number of environmental factors as well. We're going through a drought, right? If there's not water in a creek, you can't take a sample. So it's important to note that it's not just human lack of resources, but there are environmental factors as well, a number of which can have an impact on how you take that data, or if you can even take that data. Category 4, meaning one or more of your uses is threatened, so you're getting to that threshold, you're getting close to that water quality parameter, but you're not quite there yet. And then of course category 5, we have enough data to know that you're not meeting water quality standards for one or more parameters for one or more uses, and this is what lands you on that 303D list. Once you're on that 303D list, I mentioned the states are required to take action to address that, to try to address those water quality issues or get that water body delisted. We do so here in the state in 2 ways, or with 2 types of plans. TMDLs, total maximum daily loads, and watershed protection plans. And while there are differences between the 2, I'd first like to hit on some of the similarities, and then we'll do a side-by-side comparison. So both of these 2 types of plans use a watershed approach. They look at water quality issues from that watershed perspective, from that watershed boundary. Jennifer's section, if you remember, those watersheds do not adhere nicely, if ever, to those political boundaries, those cities, county boundaries, even state and international boundaries oftentimes. But by using this approach, we're looking at everything holistically, everything that within that watershed as it spans across counties, cities, other watersheds, and of course you can look at watersheds on varying scales. So the goals of a watershed approach are to identify and prioritize those water quality, quantity issues in the watershed. So what are the specific issues in that watershed that y'all are facing? Increase the public awareness and involvement. The 2 biggest similarities between these 2 plans, in my opinion, is that they both rely on stakeholder input. It's not someone sitting in an office in Dallas up at EPA or any office outside the watershed or anywhere, for example, that can tell you everything that's going on in that watershed from where they sit. It's people on the ground that live, work, recreate, have lived in this watershed for decades, generations even, that really have that local, on-the-ground knowledge about what's going on and what will work in a watershed and what won't. So while you have that expertise from those people in TCQ, EPA, and these agencies that specialize in this stuff, without that local input, you're not going to be able to develop as effective of a plan as you could otherwise. So, and this public awareness and support is really what I'm speaking to here, where the rubber meets the road, if you will. Coordinate those efforts with all the agency partners we talked about earlier, those federal, state, local, regional players. There's a lot of people, and when you start to address these water quality issues, you want to make sure that everyone's engaged and at the table. If you leave someone out, or maybe there's a perspective they can bring to the table that wouldn't otherwise be there, or even resources. So, and then of course you want to measure your success as you go through monitoring, coordinated monitoring to see how well you're doing. Obviously, the best goal of the end result, anytime you implement one of these plans, is to see a reduction in stream, to see a drop in that water quality parameter that you're looking at. So benefits of it considers all the activities that are going on in a watershed, not just those in a specific city or county, but throughout the watershed or basin. It integrates all aspects, not just the science side of things, your chemical, physical, and biological parameters, but also social aspects as well, economical factors, and factors everything as a whole into that decision-making process. It also considers the local stakeholder input, which I was hopefully trying to stress and successfully did, that it's such an important part of these planning processes. And lastly, it recognizes a varied use for water bodies and a very broad use, not just for looking at water quality in terms of public water supply, but also addressing these issues for those that are using it for ag irrigation or for recreation, for example, or to support wildlife, just to name a few. So, while those are some of the similarities, and this is a very broad overview of both of these plans, here's a couple of the differences. TMDLs are regulatory. They're required under that Clean Water Act and required by TCEQ. They're a regulatory means to address water quality issues in a water body. Whereas watershed protection plans are voluntary, they're community-driven. And the next major difference is TMDLs focus on a specific pollutant. You develop a TMDL, or total maximum daily load, which is simply a calculation on how much load that water body can assimilate for a single pollutant. So you develop TMDLs for specific pollutants, whereas watershed protection plans you can develop to address all potential pollutants, potential pollutants in a watershed or in that water body. And lastly, when you develop a TMDL, because it is regulatory, it's only developed for water bodies that are on that 303D list, that are impaired for one or more of those uses, Category 5, if you remember from a few slides back. And whereas watershed protection plans can be utilized as a preventative measure. You can go in, maybe if you have a clean water body and you'd like to prevent it from becoming impaired, or if maybe you have an impairment for bacteria but not for nutrients, you can go in and develop a watershed protection plan to address that bacterial impairment, but also look at nutrients. Things change in the future, that might be an issue in the future. So this type of plan allows you the flexibility to look at various things. And both of the plans, while differences we just named, they implement and themselves or manifest themselves through best management practices we abbreviate as BMPs. And these are specifically practices or structures that we will go in and perform or install that their main goal is to reduce or mitigate the effects of pollution. So those plans basically address the water quality issues, characterize the watershed, its specific features, the stuff at play, and they identify a set of BMPs or best management practices that we will go in and implement within that watershed, throughout that watershed, or in specific places. Often a targeting approach is used to try to get that water quality level within an acceptable range. So to sum things up, key points: water quantity is affected by climate, human activity. Water quality includes the chemical, physical, and biological parameters we talked about, and reference to that designated use in which it's assigned. Point and non-point sources are the two types of pollution that contribute to water quality issues. Non-point source pollution by far is the number one. Bacteria, nutrients, sediment being the main pollutants we're dealing with. By far, bacteria and dissolved oxygen being the main two here in Texas. And lastly, the TCEQ and State Soil and Water Conservation Board are the two primary agencies here in our state that administer our water quality law and manage programs to improve water quality and protect our water bodies.
If you have a fear that you're going to have a problem with water quality, water quantity.
A whole lot of big cities in the state of Texas that are growing at tremendous rates.
Growth is water demand.
And they're going to go somewhere and they're going to get that water.
Then you need yourself a groundwater district.
The water resources of Texas have remained virtually the same since the earliest days of settlement, but we have not. The population of this state has grown exponentially since that time. In fact, our population will likely double to 36 million by 2050. And more people means more competition for water resources. Currently, Texans generally use about 180 gallons of water per person per day in order to meet personal, municipal, and industrial needs. At that rate, we will need an additional 3.4 billion gallons of water per day to meet the demands of that doubled population. But as demand for water increases, our freshwater supplies do not. Conservation is certainly an important part of the equation, but better irrigation, water reuse, and more efficient home appliances can only do so much. So while we search for new ways to meet future demands, we must also find new ways to manage the resources we already have. In the state of Texas, there are two main sources of fresh water: surface water consisting of rivers and streams, and groundwater drawn from aquifers across the state. And while these resources have served us well to this point, we must ensure that they can do so in the future. Of course, it falls on our shoulders to properly manage these resources through the governmental process, to assure not only equitable access for all today, but to preserve the resource for future generations. The state owns surface waters, holding them in trust for the citizens. Their use is appropriated through a state-administered permitting system. However, through the legislative process, the people of Texas have time and again said that rules governing the use of groundwater are best created at the local level by local people with local interests, and we do that through groundwater conservation districts. The first groundwater conservation districts were authorized in 1949. Since then, many areas of our state have found increased need to actively manage their underground water resources, with many opting to create groundwater conservation districts. Today, some 52 operate within the state of Texas, and at the end of the 2001 legislative session, 35 more were authorized. The first groundwater conservation districts were created in the western half of the state, where groundwater has long been heavily relied upon. In the years since, we've seen a steady march eastward, with new districts created in the central portions of the state. And today, districts are being created mainly in the eastern sections of Texas, as these areas begin to realize the potential of their groundwater resources. Most districts are managed by an elected board, though some recently created districts have appointed board members. In general, the size of the board ranges from 5 to 11 members, serving 4-year staggered terms. These boards meet at least once per quarter. They are the neighbors and friends you select to look after your groundwater interests. These are local people, chosen to make local decisions. As government organizations, groundwater conservation districts are accountable to the public. Districts are funded by you, often through property taxes. Therefore, they must make you aware of what they are doing with your money. Because of this, they are subject to the Open Meetings and Records Acts of the state of Texas. They operate on a fiscal year budget and are subject to annual audits on accounts, receipts, and contracts. The basic job of a groundwater conservation district was laid out in the original 1949 legislation. They must create and implement a comprehensive management plan for that district. They are in charge of permitting large wells, and the district must keep records of all well activity within its borders. From the time the district is confirmed by election, it has 2 years to evaluate resources and complete the management plan. The plan works for efficient use of groundwater and against both water waste and land subsidence. It will include specific details about the acts, procedures, and measures needed to execute the plan. And recognizing the evolving nature of our communities, the plan is not static. It may be amended at any necessary point and must be reevaluated and readopted every 5 years. This planning process defines goals for the management of groundwater resources. These goals can vary from district to district. In some areas, the goals will be maintaining the aquifer as a sustainable resource. Others will allow all pumpage to deplete a percentage of the reservoir capacity. And there are thousands of other management goals covering everything from water levels to quality control. The process culminates in the creation of rules designed to achieve these goals. These rules cover the conservation, preservation, protection, prevention of water waste, control of land subsidence, and recharge of the resource. Districts are required to establish water well permitting and registration programs. Through these efforts, the district is better able to quantify the impacts on the aquifer from pumpage. An efficient water well inventory, permitting, and registration program allows for overall understanding of groundwater use and production within the district. Districts require well drillers to provide records on drilling, equipping, and completion of water wells. Wells producing more than 25,000 gallons of water per day may be required to have a permit. These wells are subject to the district's rules on well spacing, drilling, equipment, and alteration. Often there are exceptions from the permitting process for wells incapable of pumping 25,000 gallons per day. Exemptions may also exist for those wells supplying domestic needs, providing water for livestock, and certain wells permitted by the Railroad Commission of Texas. But all wells are subject to district rules governing their construction, preventing unnecessary groundwater discharge and aquifer pollution. These basic duties are standard for all groundwater conservation districts. Beyond these, the initial legislation may grant a district the authority to perform other specific duties. Then the Board of Directors, with input from the local population, must decide which programs best suit their aquifer management goals.
We periodically take say 40 or 50 water level and water quality samples to get a snapshot, a point in time of the condition north, south, east, and west within our jurisdiction.
Perhaps the most important of these options is the ability to monitor the groundwater resource. The information gathered in these efforts impacts every management decision a district makes. Often wells are drilled solely for this monitoring process. However, some districts work with producers to achieve an even greater understanding of demands on the resource.
We installed 150 meters on a voluntary basis with ag producers. Metered ag numbers are very hard to come by, and so we approached it that we bought the meters and install them, and we'll read them on a monthly basis. And we've had real good participation from our ag people. Once they get the meters put in place, they figure out that that's some very good information for their management.
We're injecting dyes into these recharge features, and we're coming up with some, very valuable scientific information.
Research is another important activity a district may choose to conduct.
Some people used to speculate that it may take as much as 12 months for water to travel the 9 or 10 miles to Barton Springs from Onion Creek. We have seen dye that we've injected under high flow conditions reach the springs in less than a week.
Gaining specific information like this through research better shapes and defines a management plan.
Our research activities all center around how to quantify how much water we've got. We're still trying to get our arms around what is the carrying capacity or the sustainable yield of the aquifer. Historically, we have received grant research dollars from the Water Board, from EPA and TNRCC that support our scientific efforts.
As vital as research is for groundwater conservation districts, it is seldom cheap. For that reason, most districts seek outside funding for such projects and similar costs.